Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Zoom literary lecture brought to us by Wilton Library. And a special welcome to our waitlisted guests who are watching through our YouTube live stream. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager at the Wilton Library, and I'm so pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Before we begin, just a few notes. Your microphones and cameras are off, and it's important that you keep them off during the program. As we did last week, we'll do the Q&A with you folks sending me a question or a comment in the chat function, and I will relay them to Mark at the end of his presentation. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read Mark's illustrious biography, which you can also see in our program description. And so with that, I will turn this over to Mark. Mark.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for returning or coming today for the first time. If this were a lecture in the usual format, whether in a college course or teaching adults in some other venue as here, this second lecture would start by my asking you the question that I can't quite ask because I can't have your answer. So far, what's it like to read Ulysses? What is it actually like? What's the climate of Ulysses like? What's the challenge of reading it like? I will try to pose that question again and give partial answers as we go, including at the end of this talk. I will say that I am sometimes asked to consult with private book groups. I have 5. But others who want to start up a book group on their own and don't want a leader but want some advice, I tell them that to have a good book discussion, you only need to ask 2 fundamental questions that of course have many, many parts. One is, what is this book about? And the second is, what's it like to read this book? Neither of those are simple questions. One of them goes to the issue of the subject matter, which may be different things to different people. It is true that Gone with the Wind is a novel about the Civil War in America. It's also true that it's about the Great Depression. It's set before the Depression, but it is published during the Depression. And when Scarlett O'Hara says, "I'll never go hungry again," people reading that novel had more than one terrible American event in their head. And the second question, what's it like to read this book, will vary from person to person. It's a much more revealing question than, did you like this book? So I will get to that. I ended last time noting that Joyce abandoned Stephen Dedalus as the focus of the novel at the end of chapter 3, which he called Proteus, because he was an impossible person, someone too self-conscious, too self-consumed, too little self-aware to serve as the everyman vessel that Joyce required for his great modern epic of everyday life. And that instead, Joyce turned in chapter 4, Calypso, to his great possible man, Leopold-Bloom. Today, I'd like to take us through the midpoint of the novel, the first 9 of the 18 books, ending with Scylla and Charybdis that takes place at the National Library. I will say, looking ahead to next time, in my 3rd lecture, I will cover, as it were, the rest of the wandering of Odysseus up to chapter 15, and then leave the last 3 chapters of Penelope's part, 16, 17, and 18, to the 4th conversation. Before I continue with chapter by chapter, let's remember just how similar and different these 2 male characters are in the novel. Stephen, of course, is an Irishman. He's 22 years old. Bloom is of Jewish descent, but Irish-born and Protestant, later on converting to Catholicism to marry Molly. He's 38 years old. Stephen is an artist, an old and time-honored calling going back to and beyond ancient Greece, a special kind of calling in Irish culture, I would say. While Bloom is an advertising salesman, a canvasser who sells ad by going store to store, venue to venue, walking around the city. That was a relatively new trade in 1904. Modern advertising begins really in the first decades of the 20th century. Stephen is self-exiled, having returned to Dublin after leaving Ireland for his mother's funeral, that is, returning for his mother's funeral after leaving Ireland. Bloom has been socially exiled for a number of reasons, as we shall see, but not the least of which is that he's still viewed as a Jew by anti-Semitic strangers and even colleagues. Calypso, the chapter that serves as a pivot from the first three chapters of the Telemachus-Stephen, ushers in the 12 Bloom chapters, the wandering of Ulysses, and we'll touch on the first 6 of those today, including Calypso. In book 5 of the Odyssey, it's revealed that Odysseus is in bondage to the goddess Calypso, whose name means the concealer. He's hidden from the world. He's hidden in some ways even from the epic. The corresponding chapter in Ulysses shows a subservient Bloom, not quite in bondage, but not free, aware of both Molly's very poorly conceived affair with Blaze's Boylan, and also the letter that he himself delivered that very day, which confirms the assignation. Throughout the bedroom scene, the narrator says, a strip of torn envelope peeped out from under the dimpled pillow. And that narrator, of course, is seeing that from Bloom's point of view. The chapter begins famously, Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. The oversized M in the original edition was meant to invoke Molly, that is the figure in the novel that Bloom is mainly consumed with, just as the first chapter has an oversized S in the original edition for Stephen, who is the character that Stephen is most consumed with in the novel, which goes to the point of other-directedness and self-directedness. So as Bloom makes himself a decidedly non-kosher breakfast of kidney fried in butter, the chapter ends with his relieving himself in the privy out back with a bowel movement that could hardly be farther removed from the aesthetic and philosophical abstractions of Stephen in Telemachus. Most readers will agree that Bloom's defecation is at once more natural and in its own way more productive than Stephen's act at the end of the preceding chapter of picking his nose and leaving his snot on display on the ledge of a rock. I want to say at this point that with respect to all people's tastes, the Romantics at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, both in prose and poetry, thought that part of what they had to do was in the French term, épater le bourgeoisie, shock the middle class. They thought that one of the ways to make their movement known was to rattle people's sensibility. That's not what Joyce is doing. I'm not saying he didn't take pleasure in it, but he's not trying to puncture middle-class stuffiness. He's trying to open up all of human activity to the lens of literary enterprise. There's nothing off topic. There's nothing out of bounds. And he's doing this partly because he believes that that's what an artist should do. And he does it because he believes that one of the problems with Ireland is its parochialism, its closing off doors and windows to human experience. Of course, the final word in Calypso is poor dignum, when Bloom recalls the fate of the man who was a friend of Simon Douglas, Stephen's father, and whose funeral he will attend in chapter 6. Paddy Dignam is based in part on an actual Dubliner whose name was Matthew Francis Kane, who died in Dublin Bay of an accidental drowning on 10 June 1904. He died in the water, swimming, not able to get back to the boat that his friends were on, of a heart attack, possibly from years of alcohol abuse. He was 39. The point here is that the chapter ends with Bloom's mental expression of sympathy for another's fate, so far removed from the closing lines of Aeolus, which I invite you to look at your leisure. Earlier in the chapter, as Bloom feeds his cat, he wonders, as I mentioned last time, what he himself looks like to the cat. Another example of his being able to think outside himself. The first expression that's quoted in the chapter is the sound that the cat makes, which Joyce renders as M-K-G-N-A-O, meow. Thank you, no applause. What's significant about this is that a few pages later, when Bloom asks Molly if she wants breakfast, she answers half asleep with her first spoken word in the novel, which Joyce represents as M-N, and which Bloom rightly interprets as no. She declines breakfast. She's not quite up. And so while many people, even if they haven't read the novel, are aware of the novel's famous concluding words spoken by Molly at the end of what Joyce called the Penelope chapter, yes, I said yes, I will, yes, and that last yes has a capital Y. Very few realize that her first spoken word in the novel is no, a barely unintelligible no. The next chapter, Lotus Eaters, is suffused with languor and soporific activity, as well as references to the incense in church, chloroform, and laudanum when he goes to the chemist. In Book 9 of the Odyssey, our wandering hero tells King Alcinous of how some of his crew disembarked in the land of the Lotus Eaters and had eaten of the flower and decided they wanted to stay there forever, forgetful of their homeland, as Homer says. Odysseus tells the king that he rescued his infected men and had them rejoin the crew. Bloom, during this chapter, will pick up a letter from Martha Clifford, with whom he's having a secret non-contact affair. We should remember that he deals with a hidden letter, just as Molly deals with a hidden letter. He stops by Catholic church, incense-filled Catholic church, watches part of a mass, goes to pick up some face cream for Molly, has to return later on to get it, buys a bar of soap that he puts in his pocket and becomes a kind of security blanket, like the potato that he was carrying earlier, which his mother gave him as a kind of good luck charm, a kind of talisman. And there are several places in the novel where an unsettled Bloom reaches into his pocket to caress, not sexually, but to give himself some courage or comfort, like thumb sucking, either the potato or the bar of soap. He also talks to an acquaintance about the Gold Cup horse race that's scheduled to be run that day. And there's an interesting little misunderstanding about Bloom throwing away the flyer and being misunderstood, that he's telling his listener to bet on throwaway. Throwaway will win and did win the race that day. And it's one of those just sort of accidental, serendipitous things. The chapter ends with Bloom imagining the bath he's going to take and imagines his pale body soaking in the water with his genitals floating and looking like, we're told, a languid floating flower. Flower is the surname he's using in his correspondence with Martha Clifford. He's Henry Flower, and Flower, of course, playing off of Bloom. It's always true, I would venture to say, in literary fiction, that when a character is able to imagine another scene or has a dream of another scene beyond his or her control, should always pay careful attention, because it is a non-literary character creating something imaginative. And a character who can imagine, no matter how good or evil or mediocre they might seem in the work of art, always has an advantage from, I think, the author's point of view, over characters who cannot imagine. So he ends that chapter on lethargy, imagining himself languorously floating in a public bath. In Hades, the 6th chapter, Bloom rides in a carriage to Dignam's funeral with 3 other mourners, one of whom is Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, Odysseus descends to Hades, where he encounters the shade of his mother, former companions from his battle at Troy, and importantly, the prophet Tiresias. So as the Irish mourners ride to the cemetery, Bloom points out to Simon Dedalus his son Stephen, clad in black because of his mother's recent death, and he himself, Bloom, grieves anew the loss of his own son Rudy, who would, had he lived, be 11 years old, half as old as Stephen. And this frequent memory of Rudy, the son that he no longer has, makes Bloom a grieving father throughout the novel, whereas Stephen is a grieving, but in a much more complicated way, son to his recently dead mother. Bloom, of course, like the men in the carriage, is dressed in black, and so is Stephen walking down the street because he has to wear black for some period of time after his mother's funeral, which has already occurred. And he's also wearing what he calls his Hamlet hat. And it turns out that one of the literary works that I think is almost as important as the Odyssey to an understanding of the novel is Hamlet. And if you read the chapter in the library where Stephen goes on and on about Hamlet and Shakespeare, I apologize. No, you will know some of what Stephen and Joyce thought about that. It's important for us to see that Hamlet is partly a play about a son who has lost 2 parents, a murdered father and a unfaithful mother, and who is burdened by being very much self-involved like Stephen and being tasked by the ghost of the father that he loved to do something that it does not come easy to him. We'll be talking more about Hamlet in subsequent lectures. So the carriage with the several mourners also passes Blazes Boylan, who'll be having sex with Molly in her bed later that day. And they see also a well-known Jewish moneylender, again, based on a historical figure, whose presence gives rise to several anti-Semitic comments from Bloom's carriage mates, completely insensitive to Bloom, who not only tries to avoid taking offense, but gets into the spirit. Part of what he's trying to do in several scenes of the novel is dissociate himself from what in this scene is called the tribe of Reuben in order to put forth his Irishness. And of course, it's one of the problems always of minority cultures who feel they're marginalized and who sometimes get caught in the trap of disowning their heritage to belong. There are several scenes in which Bloom confronts that dilemma. The 7th chapter, Aeolus, in book 10 of the Odyssey, Aeolus is the keeper of the winds who gives Odysseus a bag of good winds and a bag of ill winds. That chapter takes place in the Freeman newspaper office, where the transitions between sections are marked by headlines like those appearing in a newspaper. I want to say that one aspect of the novel that I will touch on probably next time is that it is self-consciously a book about books. The fact that it's impossible to read Ulysses for any length of time, sometimes not only not beyond a chapter, not even within a paragraph, without being reminded that you're reading a book. You're reading something that is not real, that doesn't let you drift into the sense that this is real life, the way many of us like to luxuriate in a really readable novel that doesn't require us to work. It doesn't mean it can't be challenging and intelligent and satisfying. I'm not talking about what some people call a beach read, but a book that while you're reading it doesn't let you think that Pip or Elizabeth Bennet is an imaginary character. While you're reading it, you're convinced that Hedda Gabler is actually a woman and you react to her plight the way you would to any human being. Joyce is totally invested in breaking that contract or expectation. So he keeps reminding us that we are reading a written work, whether it's the newspaper headlines in this section or the fragments in a section of stream of consciousness where we're not sure who's talking or what they're seeing, or a chapter that you'll read for next time if you haven't already, where the course of the chapter is meant to emulate the evolution of English language. He's being playful, but he's being playful also to a point. He wants you to know that art matters, and he feels this especially strongly in a culture which he felt was interested in poetry and artists and writers in a dreamy, foolish way, and not interested in actually doing the work of what art requires, which is going out of yourself and meeting another. It's a very serious issue with Joyce, and it's part of the reason the book is written the way that it is. So Bloom is in the newspaper office checking on an advertisement he has placed, and he's largely ignored and even mocked by the men, including again Stephen's father, Simon, who are conversing there. After Bloom leaves, Stephen enters the newsroom, dutifully, if resentfully, delivering Mr. DC's letter, you may remember from chapter 2, where he gives Stephen at the school the task of delivering this important letter about hoof and mouth disease. That chapter is called Nestor in the Odyssey. Nestor is a great tamer of horses, a king, a counselor. Instead of being a keeper of horses, Mr. DC wants to make a comment about hoof and mouth disease, and he decides to do it by writing essentially a letter to the editor. There again is the mock epic, the mock heroic that figures so often in the novel. The Odyssey is exalted as a standard, and current present day Dublin is held up against it to its demerits. That's an old motif in literature, but it's certainly operating here. This idea that the heroic thing he will do about horses is write a letter to the editor reminds me of Duck Soup, where the Marx Brothers movie, where Groucho, I have an extraordinarily complicated literary background. Groucho Marx is the president of Fredonia, and he's insulted by the ambassador from another country, and he's not sure what he'll do in retaliation. And he says at one point in complete seriousness, I have a good mind to ring his doorbell and run. That's the kind of level of activity of a letter to the editor about hoof and mouth disease. Stephen delivers his letter and departs. Once he's gone, coincidentally, Bloom re-enters, emphasizing here the near miss quality of their past so frequently in the novel. From the claustrophobic confines of the small office of the newsroom, Bloom, in fact, is hit in the back by the door as someone enters. We move in chapter 8, which is called Lestrygonians in Joyce's plan, to the outdoors in an encounter-filled section as Bloom heads to a restaurant around 1 o'clock for lunch. In book 10 of the Odyssey, the Lestrygonians are a tribe of cannibalistic giants. Along the way, on the sidewalk, walking around, Bloom sees a child that he knows is without a mother, and he expresses in his own heart sympathy for all such children. He meets his old girlfriend, who talks about an acquaintance, Mina Purefoy, who's in protracted labor at the hospital, and he resolves that he will visit her later that day. He sees a group of sandwich board men who are walking advertisements for Heelys, H-E-L-Y-S, Bloom's former employer. And they're called sandwich boards because when you wear it, you are sandwiched between the placards of the advertisement, which has writing on it front and back. You're all familiar with it. It was a newish thing at the turn of the last century. Bloom thinks again of his dead son, reveals that Molly could never like sex again after his death at several days old. And what the novel makes clear indirectly is that the only sex that the husband and wife have had is anal sex, because that way it won't create another baby. It's very poignant. It's one of those things that is heartbreaking, but the censors saw as filthy. And he remembers here that's part, the death of his young son over 10 years ago, just a few days old, is one of the things that radically altered his sexual relations with his wife. In the chapter, images of food and death and food as death, cannibalism, you're going to get eaten, you're going to die first, fill Bloom's mind as he thinks of the gap between his former life of happiness with Molly and his current torpor. And he says, me, period, and me now. Me, period, and me now. And one of his burdens is to try to make a connection between the person he was and the person he is. That's part of the work he is unconsciously doing in the novel. There's an echo in that line, that important line, of a thought that had occurred to Bloom in the Hades chapter at the funeral, as he saw Dignam's coffin descend into the grave. He thinks, if we were all suddenly somebody else, if we could all suddenly be somebody else, if we could avoid the fact of our mortality or our pain or our recognition that our wife is no longer faithful to us by becoming someone else, would that be a kind of escape? Would that be something that would save us? Stephen, by contrast, plays with the notion that what if he were no longer the same person? And you remember at one point in the novel, he thinks that he owes somebody money. But if he argued that your body changes over the course of several weeks or months as cells die and replicate themselves, so you're not really the same person you were a year ago, could you argue then that I'm not the one who owes you that money? That kind of playful, silly notion of being someone else, where for Bloom, it's driven by empathy of a man now dead, who, if he were given the chance, would want to be somebody alive. Bloom returns to his typical other directness when, near the end of the chapter, he helps a young blind man cross the street and contemplates the circumstances of the sightless. What are they able to do? Is it true that their tastes improve? Can they see things? Could he manage to walk without his cane if he memorized the terrain and so on? Very typical of Bloom to be in his head and also out of his head. Scylla and Charybdis is the name Joyce gave to his 9th chapter, the last one I'm covering briefly in this overview, a reference to the Odyssey's book 12, where a description is given of the treacherous route to be taken between a 6-headed monster and a powerful whirlpool. The first is Scylla, the second is Charybdis. In Ulysses, the 2-part image used to name the chapter encompasses in Stephen's long oration the tensions between Plato and Aristotle, between artists and their art, between youth and maturity, between the narrow dogma of religion and liberal spiritualism. But I think it's best seen as the fundamental oppositional nature of reality. We are always having to balance things between this and that, on the one hand, on the other hand. And I include in this, as I've been arguing since last week, the fundamental opposition between I and you, between the self and other. This chapter takes place around 2 p.m. at the National Library as the rhythm of Ulysses again returns to an indoor setting. You can see a kind of shifting from Stephen in the tower at the beginning and then being self-exiled, his being in the schoolhouse, and then in the third chapter, walking along the Strand by himself, being in the newspaper office, then being outside, and so on. There's a kind of systole and distole, a kind of expansion and contraction, not symmetrical, not every other chapter, but clearly in the novel. Here it returns to an indoor setting in the library in the longest of the novel's first 9 chapters. This is. Tellingly, the chapter is dominated by Stephen. Many people find it one of the less congenial chapters to read. Stephen expounds on his theories about Shakespeare and Hamlet to a group of actual writers and men of letters. The people identified in this chapter were writers, editors, poets who actually existed and lived or could have visited Dublin. Along the way, Stephen cites the French poet Mallarmé and his insightful line about Prince Hamlet. Mallarmé wrote, "Il se promène, lisant au livre de lui-même." He walks around reading in the book of himself. This image of extreme self-involvement, it's a beautiful description of Hamlet. It's taken from the scene where Hamlet is walking and going to be waylaid by Ophelia, who has been set up by her father, who's watching along with Claudius, to see whether it's true that Hamlet's oddness is accounted for by his unrequited love for Ophelia. That's what he's putting on. Polonius is convinced of that because it's his daughter. Claudius is not so sure. And as he walks along, the poet Mallarmé describes it as he's reading in the book of himself. And of course, that's one of the great issues in Hamlet. The this and that he has to figure out is he's a scholar, he's intensely introspective, and yet he's been tasked by his father to kill a king, to avenge the killing of a king by killing a king. And he spends a lot of the play in his own head, partly necessarily, he doesn't feel he can confide in people, and partly because he's Hamlet. So this image of extreme self-involvement is counterbalanced a few pages later by another literary citation, this time from the Nobel Prize winning Belgian poet and playwright, Maurice Maeterlinck, that as we move through the events of our everyday lives, he says, we are always meeting ourselves. You may remember the passage says, when Socrates leaves his home, he finds Socrates on the doorstep. When Judas goes out, he follows the path that Judas must take. So he picks a positive and a negative image from history. There's a line in one of my favorite of Joseph Conrad's novels, The Secret Agent, where a character says to himself, we never cease to be ourselves. We never cease to be ourselves. You can say of someone, wow, that was really out of character for you. And people like Joyce and Conrad would say, no, you're just seeing more of the character. It's impossible for someone to act out of their character. So this notion of always meeting ourselves in the sense of recognizing that other people have the same kind of needs, the same kind of frailties that we do, is the message of the book. If you're looking for a big ticket takeaway, if you're not sure if you can come back next Saturday or the Saturday after, and you want to know, Schenker, what's the big idea of this novel? The big idea of this novel is meet other people, say yes to life, don't worry about the cacophony of voices. That's the message. A British musical entertainer, whose name escapes me right now, said in a line that was so often quoted by the poet H Auden that it was ascribed to him, even though he didn't originate it, is that God put us here to help other people. What the other people are here for, nobody knows. And of course, the force of that wit is that there are people who think of other people as the recipients of our charity. If I only thought of those of you assembled today electronically, some of whom I've known for years, I've seen some of the names on the list. If I thought that the only point of view was to be listeners to my lecture, or Michael wouldn't have me back, there'd be nothing other directed about that. But if I can recognize that you have an existence like my existence, I can teach you or converse with you. A doctor can heal somebody. A philanthropist can give money to the poor, and not just write them off as a sick person, an ignorant person, a hungry person. That's what Joyce is getting at. We are constantly meeting ourselves, that is, people like us. So it's nearly halfway through this 9th chapter before Bloom is even mentioned. The attendant tells the librarian in a little aside that as the man here seeking files of the Kilkenny people, we know that he's working on the ad that we learned about in chapter 7. And Bloom does not, in fact, appear until the closing lines of the chapter, where he is clearly the unnamed man who passes between Stephen and Buck Mulligan, perhaps another Scylla and Charybdis, passing between these two very different young Irishmen. And when he does so, Bloom is mocked by Mulligan as the wandering Jew who might be a homosexual lusting after Stephen. So we're right to ask ourselves the question, what accounts for Bloom's near total disappearance from this chapter, whose end marks the halfway point of the novel? And I'm going to offer 3 suggestions, all of which I think may be right. And again, if this were a different format, I would love to hear your thoughts on the matter. One is that it gives Bloom a chance to escape from the novel. Chapter 8 ended with an unsettled Bloom seeing Boylan again on the street, as his rival is described by an accumulation of his sartorial details. The line is straw hat and sunlight, period, tan shoes, period, turned up trousers, period, it is. His recognition in this collection of parts that there is Boylan again. Turned up trousers was new at this time, so he's seen as somebody kind of dandyish. You may remember that in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the narrator, who's a young man who imagines himself much older than he is, wonders at the end if he should wear his trousers rolled, that is, if he should do the faddish thing in the 1912, 16, and turn up his cuffs. So to avoid him, Bloom detours from his path to the library and instead heads to the National Museum, which is off to the right, where we learn early and late that he will follow up on his plan to inspect the backsides of the sculptures of women to see if they are anatomically correct. A part of Bloom's relish transcends the internal organs of beasts and fowls. The point is he's really terrified and he needs to get out of the street and he needs to go somewhere. You may remember also that earlier he said to himself, much of the novel is Bloom saying things to himself, that he will write back Martha Clifford when he's in the library. So it's as if Joyce, in order to emphasize that Bloom needs to be taken out of circulation, takes him out of the circulation in the novel. I certainly think that's one possible explanation. Another is that it gives us a chance to see again what is, as it were, wrong with Stephen. Stephen goes on and on and on about his theory. I think it's the rare reader, even someone who's a fan of Shakespeare and Hamlet, who finds the talking to worthy of the investment you have to make in the chapter. And I think it's gives Joyce a chance to say to us again, see why this is not a novel where the camera is resting on the shoulder of this young man. And then thirdly, I think it gives Joyce a chance at self-indulgence to show off theories that he himself held, to do a kind of reminding us that he's the person who was Stephen, who became the person reading this novel. Joyce had a tremendous sense of self-satisfaction in thinking that what he would write was writing a book for the ages. and he had the advantage of being right. So I think it's all those at the same time. This idea of Joyce self-indulging and self-criticizing is at the heart of Portrait of an Artist, which I mentioned, I think, last time, that Joyce took very seriously that as a young man depicted in that novel, 1914 it was published, he was an artist in the making, and he took himself very seriously. But Joyce also recognized that he took himself too seriously and that he was only a young man, only an artist in the making. And that's the way to hear the title, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, not quite where he's going to be. So for all those reasons. So in half an hour or so, I've just summarized a number of actual events and places and people that Bloom participates in. Transactions, he buys kidney, he buys a bar of soap, he talks to people, he makes plans. Question, and he goes to lunch. A question arises, if that's true, why don't we remember the novel that way? I don't know anyone who's read Ulysses only once or twice who says, and I like the way that when Bloom went into the chemist shop and he was asking about the cream, we don't remember the novel that way because it doesn't give us a chance to experience it that way. What I've just summarized as a kind of itinerary is fractured in the novel by the intense interiorness of Bloom's consciousness. He also has a stream of consciousness. The difference is he's other directed as he thinks. We can't think with anyone else's consciousness. Bloom is as interiorly alive as Stephen is. He's just more sensitive to other people. So we don't experience it the way we might in a novel where one thing actually happens after another. What's more, it's discontinuous over several chapters which have different styles and where we can't be sure when the focus is going to shift. No one's prepared that Stephen is going to show up in the last chapter and dominate it again, any more than people were prepared that he was going to disappear in chapter 4, especially if they came to Ulysses from having read Portrait of an Artist, a kind of sequel. So how do we experience the novel? And I want to say we experience it as a kind of a magnificent mess. The critic Wolfgang Iser, I-S-E-R, has commented that one way in which Ulysses differs from what we expect from the modern novel is that its many pictures and fictional episodes of everyday life that are that fill the novel never converge into a defined picture. And as a result, readers will be continually tempted, I'm quoting him now, continually tempted to try to establish some consistency in all the signs, patterns, fragments, etc. People are looking for some kind of holistic way of thinking about the book. But Joyce does not provide that defined picture, nor even give us the refuge of consistency, and no appeal to the Odyssey, nor to the events of Joyce's life, about which much is known, nor condition of Ireland at the start of the century will supply it. Although Ulysses is set in 1904, it's important to remember it was written in the period after the First World War and is very much a novel of its age. I'm just picking up as a prop this volume, which some of you might know, over 600 pages, an annotated notes for James Joyce's Ulysses. I own it, I've read a lot of it, I use it quite often. It's not the way to read the novel, it's a way to study the novel. If you use this as a guide and go from the novel to the guide and back, you'll wind up reading Ulysses as if you were looking at it through Venetian blinds. Instead, let the fragments flow over you. Like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which was published in exactly the same year as Joyce's masterpiece, the fragments of the literary work are not meant to contribute to a whole picture. For Eliot and for Joyce, no whole picture is available any longer in literature. There are no Homers, there are no Odysseys, there's no longer a Greek epic. It doesn't mean that when Joyce channels the Odyssey for his novel, or when T.S. Eliot invokes the ancient Sanskrit scriptures in The Wasteland, or when Picasso turns to African art in the 20s and 30s. Modernism is marked in part by a return to the primitive. When the rites of spring invoke pagan rituals, it doesn't mean we're turning to them to mock them or criticize them. We are holding them up as a model for something we cannot do in the same way, but we can do something. So in this work, as in The Wasteland and other works, the fragments are not meant to contribute to a whole picture because no whole picture is available any longer. This is very much an issue of post-World War I, a fragmentation of identity and integrity. The American poet William Carlos Williams wrote in his poem Patterson, published in 1946 after another war, the phrase "no ideas but in things," arguing for the clarity and sanity of concrete reality over abstractions. This was a great part of the philosophical core of what came to be known as the Imagist movement, that better trust a thing than an idea, because like the Europeans, Americans in the First World War, they felt that they were taken in by a grand lie, capital G, capital L. This was Hemingway's view of what the war did. And Hemingway's philosophy and his writing style, the kind of plainness of his writing style, can be seen as a kind of therapy for wanting to avoid the abstractions of big ideas. And so you will encounter of Hemingway, who's also publishing novels in the 1920s as Virginia Woolf and F. Scott Fitzgerald and our own James Joyce are, that telling how to do something like clean a fish or pitch a tent that seems unimportant and kind of banal is a kind of therapy, in the same way that some people being treated for PTSD are given very simple tasks like tying a shoe. And when you think about that, I want to read a passage from Calypso and say something about what it means for your understanding of the novel, and then I'll stop. Bloom, of course, is preparing a breakfast for his wife, and he's checking the tea kettle. And here's the quote: "On the boil, sure enough, a plume of steam from the spout. He scalded and rinsed out the teapot and put in 4 full spoons of tea, tilting the kettle then to let the water flow in. Having set it to draw, he took off the kettle, crushed the pan flat on the live coals, and watched the lump of butter slide and melt. While he unwrapped the kidney, the cat mewed hungrily against him. Give her too much meat, she won't mouse. Say they won't eat pork. Kosher. Here, he let the blood-smeared paper fall to her and dropped the kidney amid the sizzling butter sauce. Pepper. He sprinkled it through his fingers ringwise in a circle from the chipped egg cup." That's word for word from chapter 4. If you like that passage, if like me, you love that passage, that's the reason to read Ulysses. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. That's what life is like. Now, if the entire novel were written that way, it'd be a lot more accessible. If this were written by someone like Sherwood Anderson, it would be seen of accessible language like that. Joyce complicates things for reasons I'll talk about next time, but that's the core of the novel. And I will say that the few times I have tried to teach portions of Ulysses to college students, God bless them, they want the opposite of what I want. They want a way not to read every word of the novel, but to have the big idea so they can say they have a big idea about Ulysses and possibly write a paper out about it. I'm not mocking them. That's their road for success, and people like me are part of the reason they think that way. But what I want my students in college, even though they disbelieve me, and anyone listening to this now, and the adults I teach in book groups, is to do just the opposite. Forget about the big idea of Ulysses. It's a big idea that's not a big idea, and I've already shared it with you. Pay attention to the small details of something like when Molly calls her husband Poldy rather than Leo. She's removed the lion part of his name in a novel that has already featured two felines, the cat who meows and the leopard of the bad dream of Haynes in the first book. You may say, well, that's not possible. It's possible. Joyce does those kinds of things. There are lots of details of artistry and human empathy, of human kindness in the book, that if you stay attentive and you skip over the stuff you don't like, I don't mean don't read it, don't worry it. There are plenty of scenes, whether it's boiling water or a reunion between characters who haven't seen each other for a long time, or the inevitable joining by the end of the novel of the two wanderers that we've been talking about. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was splendid, as expected. I've got a question and a comment, but we have one actually that someone posted in the chat at the very end last week when I was just about to turn the session off. So why don't we start with that one?
Okay.
She wrote, of course, thank you very much. This is very interesting. You have a question regarding Joyce's use of Epiphany. Would you say that these revelations in Ulysses are analogous to the action of the gods in the Odyssey?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about Epiphany. Let me say that word from the Greek, epi, meaning outside, like epidermis, and phan, P-H-A-N, meaning spirit or showing, like fantastic or phantasm or phantom, a showing. So it's a inner showing that's been turned to the outside, a manifestation of something hidden. And it's used in association with Catholicism as the label for the 12th day of Christmas, January 6th, the Epiphany, the revelation of Jesus' presence in the world by having him seen not by shepherds, but by travelers from the Orient, called the Orient then. So yes, analogous if we take analogous in a very flexible way. The whole point of natural symbolism, which I talked about at the first meeting, and the movement in literary history of the Romantic period is turning away from the notion that symbols come from God, who gives them to our brain so that we can have a hint of something supernatural, and instead a recognition consonant with the rise of Freud, but not caused by him, that human beings make symbols all the time, and that the symbols reveal to us our own inner lives, maybe psychologically, or the inner workings of the world, and that they are revelations, but they don't come from gods, they come from us. So in George Eliot's Silas Marner, so a 19th century novel, when Epi, a blonde-haired little waif, shows up on the doorstep of the miserly Silas, who has been looking for his stolen bag of gold coins, he's myopic, it's contractually obligated if you're a miser, and he mistakes the glowing child in snowy weather at Christmas time for his returned gold. It turns out she's not gold, but she becomes the treasure of his heart, and he associates her with the Christ child because she's found at Christmas, and she's a little child who helps a miser not be a cranky old man, like Heidi, which is published in the same century. You'd be wrong to think that George Eliot wants you to look at Epi and think of Jesus Christ. What he wants you to do is stop looking away from Epi. Stop looking into religion or supernaturalism. Let the Epiphany say, where your treasure is, there also is your heart. And you don't need a testament, old or new, to teach you that. That's how Epiphany works in Joyce. I can give other examples next time.
Great, thanks very much. So this is something that I think it's bothered me before, and it's been bothering me a little as I've been reading the book again now. So
Michael, can I just pause? There are no other questions from the audience about anything today? Just want to make sure, because I see where
oh, hang on, just got one. Nope. Now I just got one that just says, "Thank you very much for the response." That I think was the person that left it last week.
Thanks. Okay.
I'll keep my eye on the chat if anybody chimes in the next few minutes. So, Joyce gives us hints every once in a while as we're going through that Bloom knows about Molly's appointment for adultery at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
But unless I've totally missed something every time I've read this, he never actually lets you know how Bloom knows that. First of all, is that an accurate reading? And if it is Joyce trying to do something particular by letting us know he knows it, but he never lets us know how?
Yeah. So I think that's right. He certainly knows it, and I don't believe he ever lets us know how. But if we take the scene in Calypso where he delivers a letter in this very bold hand, the envelope is addressed, from Blazes, who's writing to Molly, and she's clearly, he's the manager of her tour. She's an amateur singer, but of some ability. It's clear the way she hoards it and hides it, that it's not something that's just businesslike. Also, Blazes Boylan, like his name, is something of a show-off and a dandy. There's nothing circumspect about him. So you can only imagine that if Bloom has ever been in their presence, it would be easy enough to tell that there's something going on there.
Got it.
Bloom is not a stupid man. He's not as educated as Stephen is about certain things that Bloom doesn't care about. But Bloom is a very savvy person. Many people who hear about him but don't read the book imagine him as much older than he is and much more flawed than he is. He's actually quite striking as a character for such a novel.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can see how Bloom is perceptive enough that he would know something's going on. I just always got stuck on the fact that he seems to know it's at 4 o'clock, and I can never figure out how he knows that.
Yeah. Well, again, for all that's in the novel, as with any novel, there's a lot that's left out of the novel. So it's possible that something came up early in the week, not on this Thursday, this everyday day of the week, Thursday, the 16th of June, in which Molly has made it clear that she needs to be doing something, or Bloom has to occupy himself. I'll say again, and maybe to wrap up, I'm never punching a clock at these events, but I want to be mindful of other people's time commitment. When I pick the longest way round as the shortest way home, I want to say again, in the context of the chapter in which that appears, Bloom is doing several things at once. He's thinking that if he gets off the main drag, he'll meet fewer people, he'll be less delayed, and he'll get to where he's going sooner. At the same time, where he's going is home, where he doesn't want to be because he knows what he'll encounter if he's too early. And so he's actually looking for a detour that will waste time. From my point of view, and I like to think from James's point of view, he's making the argument that the fullest life is a life that takes you out and about, that takes you around and not just directly to, that follows the arc of a parabola that gets you to where you're going and covers more time, more space, and in a novel like this, more people, which is the great idea of the novel, other people.
Sure. So someone just asked, why doesn't Bloom have a real affair?
Well, I like to think that's a question everyone can answer for themselves, by which I don't mean that that's an impertinent question, but I think the way we might say about someone of our acquaintance, why does someone who feels he's being cuckolded, why doesn't he have his own affair? Why does he luxuriate in taking a dump at the end of the chapter, like a prize-winning story, and then use it to wipe his backside? Why does he follow a scene in which he's worried about the next time his wife will have sex? He's worried about the first time that his daughter will have sex. He's thinking back to the first time he and Molly had sex, a very important scene that's going to come up significantly in the last chapter. Why does he think what I'm going to do is go out and take a public bath? Why does one person go out and get drunk, another person go out and overeat, another person write a letter to the editor? I say this with all respect. It depends upon how you see Bloom, that he would be courageous enough to have an affair, but maybe timid enough not to commit to it in person. Maybe that's his Scylla and Charybdis. I mean that without making a joke. I say when I teach Oedipus Rex that the key to understanding the tragedy of Oedipus Rex is that when he hears the oracle tell him that he is doomed by the prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother, have sex with his mother, which is a transgression to the ancient Greek mind that we can't imagine. You could say that if he were more heroic, more blasphemous, more self-confident, he would say, no oracle is going to control my fate. I'm not going anywhere. Mom, Dad, pass the moussaka. I'm staying right here. And that if on the other end of the two poles, he was so fearful, so timid, so unheroic that he thought, if that's my fate, moving to another town is not going to help me. I'll just stay here. Mom, Dad, pass the mac and cheese. And if he had done any of those two similar actions for opposing reasons, we wouldn't be talking about him because there'd be no play. What he does, what everyone does, what all of us do, is the mixed thing that makes us human beings. He is defiant enough to say, I'm going to beat this rap, but he's fearful enough to think, I got to move out of town. I think it might actually come through, but I think I can do something about it. And what Sophocles knows is that this and thatness is what makes for human nature and human tragedy.
Got it.
Sounds like a curtain line, Michael.
What's that?
I said that sounded like a curtain line.
I think so.
Yeah.
There was one other question. I'm going to give it a try because I'm not 100% certain what it's referring to. He's referring to where you said in chapter 9 that the book, the novel, Joyce, whatever, is giving Bloom a chance to escape the novel. And he's asking, what are the other options in addition to giving Bloom a chance to escape the novel?
You mean what are the other explanations?
Yeah, maybe that is what he's getting at.
Well, I thought I gave two. Maybe I was too brief. One is to let Joyce show off. Let Joyce show off about his own erudition, which he wasn't shy about. And the other is to give us a chance to see why Stephen is not a good person for such a novel. I do think it might be seen as a kind of midterm reset where Stephen comes in for a guest appearance. And not only is he not walking along the strand with anyone else, not only is he in his stream of consciousness, but now he's spending his time talking to a handful of people kind of endlessly. It doesn't promote affection for Stephen as the hero of an epic of everyday life.
Got it. I think that nailed it.
But if that's an unsatisfying answer to the man or woman who sent in that question, send it to my email and I'd be glad to give it a better try.
Perfect. Oh, he just said thanks. That's it. So I think you got it.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, well, look, I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Another great lecture and program. Everybody enjoy the rest of the weekend, and we'll see you all on Saturday and next Saturday. And thanks again, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.